Good evening, everybody. Welcome to CONDG, our virtual CONDG. We've got a great speaker lined up for you today. I'm going to give people a few minutes here just to start rolling in and saying hi in the chat. So if you're hanging out in the chat there, just give us a hi, a hello, to let us know that you're around. My name is Matt Groves. I know that Matt Eland is also there in the chat. Oh, I see we just got a raid. Well, thank you very much for the raid. We're just about to get started. You're all raiding at just the right time. Thank you for that raid, lucky number 11. Usually more fanfare in my channel when there's raids, but this is more of a presentation type of thing. So I have all that stuff turned off for now. But thank you all for hanging out. We got a great speaker, so this is a great time for you all to raid. I see you there, Polarin and RL Milk. So while we're waiting for people to start rolling in, this is a great time to point your browsers to the URLs you see on the screen there. So CONDG.org, that'll take you right to the meetup there, the address on the bottom. So you don't have to type the whole thing in, just go to CONDG.org. Hey, thanks for the raid, lucky number 11. Appreciate it. Have yourself a nice little break. Yeah, or you can click the link there in the chat Integer Man just posted. So there's where you can go and just join the group so you can get notified for future meetups. And if you don't want to log into Twitch for whatever reason, you can also ask your questions there. So it's a good place for you to go. You can also check out CONDG on Twitter. You can follow to get the latest news and updates on CONDG. It's really important for you to follow these various channels, because things may change from month to month about where the meetups are going to be hosted, and digitally and in person and so on. Don't expect us to be in person. That URL might not work there, Integer Man. I don't expect us to be in person anytime soon, but you never know. So stay frosty on that, and make sure to follow Twitter and sign up for the meetup, meetup.com link there. But yeah, CONDG on Twitter would be the right follow there. Oh, it does automatically correct it, so then it should work just fine. Well, I learned something new today. All right, it's about 2 after by my watch. We've got about 20 people in here, so we usually get a little more than that. So a few more minutes. We're going to hang around till I get started with the official slide deck here. Calvin will not be joining us today, by the way. Calvin Allen. He is taking care of some family matters, so he is not joining as far as I know. We all wish him well, though. If you're watching this later, Calvin, we miss you. Hope things are going well for you. That being said, yes, Calvin is awesome. That being said, last month we introduced Calvins as a hangout spot after the meetup. We're going to keep it called Calvins for now, but if there's any interest in that, it will be run by Matt, Integer Man, there in the channel. So if you're interested in that, I'll bring this up again during the slides, but if you're interested in that, just say so in the chat. If you want to do a post-CONDG hangout, you got to prepare your own appetizers and drinks, unfortunately. But we're going to have a little hangout there afterwards if you're interested. We kicked off here in less than a minute. Yeah, Integer Man is the happy proprietor of Calvins tonight. It'll be a Zoom call. It looks like Integer Man's going to set up a Zoom call if you're interested. So just if you want to bring that up, I'll be posting reminder messages during the stream, but if you're interested, just drop a message in chat. Just virtually raise your hand and say, yeah, I'll go. I'll go to Calvins tonight. Call it Calvins because it was Calvin who hosted it last month, and we used to go to Charlie's across the street. But just like all of the restaurants and bars that we frequented after CONDG, it too became victim to a shutdown. This one was a much more of a worldwide shutdown than the previous ones. but they all have the same curse. All right, so it's 6:05 now, so we're going to get started. Welcome to CONDG, everybody. I'm Matt Groves, and I'm going to take us through our normal slides here and introduce our speaker this month. But make sure to check out those links there, condig.org and condig on Twitter, to keep up to date on all the different updates that we're going to have from month to month, so you know where to go for the next meetup. The next meetup may be hosted by Calvin, for instance, or maybe hosted by Matt or somebody else. So just want to go there and keep that in mind. Even though we can't meet there in person, I still want to give a shout out to our very gracious in-kind sponsor, G2O, who has done a great job of supporting us while we were meeting in person. And even though we can't be there, I still want to give them a shout out because we definitely appreciate them and that sponsorship. Our Raffle sponsors, so we've got so a JetBrains license to give away. Anyone who enters a chat message into Twitch will automatically be entered. So another reason you want to say hello in the chat and make sure we know you're here is because you automatically get entered to win some cool prizes. So we've got some JetBrains license and some Couchbase swag to give away at the end of the presentation today. Some other meetups in the area you might want to be aware of, and I say the area even though they're probably all, as far as I know, still meeting. They're meeting online, virtually. The Central Ohio Azure group is meeting using Microsoft Teams, so you want to go check them out at coazure.org or their meetup address there. I believe that's second Monday of every month. The Columbus App Dev user group, they're also meeting virtually, so you want to check them out there on Twitter and Meetup as well, columbusappdevusergroup.com. The Buckeye SharePoint user group, I don't really know what's going on with their group. I haven't seen much information on their website there, but if you're interested in SharePoint, you might want to go check that out to see if they're still meeting and where they're meeting and how they're meeting. That's the buckeyespug.com. It's a SharePoint site, of course. And the Professional Association of SQL Server, PASS, user group here in Columbus. I believe they meet on second Thursday, and they are also meeting virtually as far as I know, or columbus.sqlpass.org. You can go check that out there. The Let's Talk IT Columbus group. This is a non-tech meetup for people in tech. It's a very cool group. You want to check that out. You can get more information there by emailing Aaron Petrie at improving.com or the meetup group, which is meetup.com/letstalkitcolumbus. You definitely want to check them out. I think August 5th is their next meeting. I just visited their meetup today. So that's coming up here shortly. Definitely want to check that out and get involved with that group. As far as our agenda, we've got, we don't have any plans to meet in person, as I mentioned, just yet. So these are all going to be virtual until further notice. As I said, Calvin was originally slated to host this one, but he had some family issues come up. So again, just want to check the site to make sure you're in the right place for the next meetup. Today is our Rocky Latka. He'll be presenting on running your business logic everywhere. We've got some other potential speakers in the hopper. We need to reach out to them soon, actually, to get some of those some commitments, some firm commitments on that. We've got a lot of options on there. So if you have suggestions for topics you'd like to see presented, that'll help us narrow down which speakers we want to bring in. Looking for .NET or .NET adjacent topics. But otherwise, the next one scheduled is F# intro with Matt, which has been pushed back a couple times. But it's totally fine if we want to do that one next, or we have other speakers in the hopper we can talk to. If you are looking for work, we usually have people raise their hand if they are hiring or if they're looking for work. So if you want to do that, just drop that right there in the chat. That's totally fine. You're absolutely, if you're looking to hire or looking for work, feel free to use the chat as networking space. If you want to be a little bit more discreet about it, that's totally understandable. If you like, you can email me, and I'd be happy to make those connections kind of behind the scenes. You can email me at mgroves.com. I've done a few of those in the last few meetings. Again, you can feel free to use the chat or the email, whatever you're comfortable with to make that happen. It's fine by me. So, like I said, we usually met at O'Charlie's after CONDG meetings, but that's been shut down. So we have O'Calvin's So again, raise your hand in chat if you're interested in that. This will be hosted by Matt in Zoom today. So if you're interested in that, you have to prepare your own apps and drinks. And it's not O Elons today. It's still going to be O Calvins. If you are interested in helping out with this group, maybe you want to help us promote the group and reach a bigger audience, or help us find some speakers, or maybe you want to host the video sometime, or anything else you'd like to help volunteer with, any suggestions, you can reach out to myself or Matt. I think those are the only two that are hanging out right now. But if you see any of these people on Twitter or in the chat, just reach out to us, or of course you can email me as well, me@mgroves, and I'd be happy to get you involved. Okay, we're just about ready to start the presentation here. I want to just remind you, if you've not been on Twitch before, basically here's a screenshot of what you're probably seeing if you're watching on your web browser. The chat there in the bottom right, that's the place where you can enter comments and questions and get entered into the raffle and just say hi. If you don't want to log into Twitch for whatever reason, that's totally fine. You can go to the meetup page and there's a comment thread there and just leave your comments. I'll be monitoring the questions and comments during the presentation, and I've already talked to Rocky about this, and he will be doing a similar thing to what Bill Semp did. That URL's out of date, by the way. Sorry about that. But CONDG.org. But he'll be doing a similar thing to what Bill Semp did, and he'll just be sort of pausing at various points in the presentation, and then any questions that I've gathered at that point, I will ask him. But ask those questions and drop those comments anytime, and I'll be monitoring during the presentation. Okay, well, that's it. I think we're ready to get started. I'm going to bring Zoom stream over here on the screen, and we'll just bring up, okay, and we'll turn on the sound. So if we could get a quick sound check from you, Rocky, please.
A quick sound check.
Okay, if that sounds okay to everybody, I'm going to let her rip and take myself off the screen. Oh gosh, another raid just in time from Bald Bearded Builder from Michael Jolly. So, okay, saying very faint audio from Rocky, so I'm going to turn up my volume a little bit more. If we get a little bit more sound check, please.
A little bit more sound check.
Does that sound okay? Okay, someone else is saying it sounds good, so I think we're ready to go. And I am taking myself off of there and off of here. Okay, and take it away, please, Rocky.
All right, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here talking to folks. I'm something that I think I've been invited to speak at the user group off and on for several months, and it just, the timing never worked out, and now all of a sudden, timing is easier when we don't have to get on an airplane and fly somewhere. So this works out quite well, and I'm excited to be here or there or wherever you are. I'm going to talk about running business logic, .NET, business logic, C#. And the cool thing, I think, is that in today's world, uh, .NET Core in particular, open source, has become extremely cross-platform and continues to expand to more platforms. Today in particular, I'm going to focus on running .NET in Windows, Linux, and also on any platform in a browser using WebAssembly. I'm generally of the opinion that the current trend, well, certainly the current trend for server code is to run everything in containers, usually in Linux. And it's not yet a trend, but I do think it will become a trend, is that more and more we will start running client-side code in WebAssembly, because it's runs in every modern browser on every device. So it's a way to get to iPhones, iPads, Android devices, Windows devices, Mac, Chromebooks, you name it. And you can write .NET code that is a smart client app that runs on all those form factors. So it's I think exciting. Before I get into that, though, I think it's important to understand that running your code everywhere, especially your business code, requires some good architectural principles. And this is something I've talked about for at least 20 years now, is this idea that you really, really need to keep your business logic separate from your presentation logic and also separate from your data access logic. And this diagram that I've got on the screen really highlights a number of key things. If you start at the top, you might say, well, why isn't there a presentation layer box? Because that's, the old fashioned way we talked about this back in the 90s. But it turns out that in the world that we've lived in now for a very long time, there is an implicit and often explicit separation between the interface itself, which might be HTML or XAML or XML, JSON, a whole bunch of different formats that might be presented to the consumer. And then your interface logic, which is often a controller or a presenter or a view model. There's, depending on which design pattern you're following in terms of how you build your presentation layer. And so I always tend to describe these as two separate boxes, because I think it's important to understand that that separation exists. The real important thing, though, is that, and this is the hard part, is that neither your interface logic layer, which might be, again, your controller, your view model, whatever it is, nor your interface layer. So that might be your HTML or your Razor pages or your code behind or whatever you're using. Zero business logic should be there. And that's not always easy to accomplish. And it's awfully easy to slip up and say, oh, it'd be so easy to throw a little validation logic, in the UI itself. I'll just use a some sort of graphic control widget in my UI framework that does the validation, and I won't put the validation into my quote unquote business layer. And the problem with that is, over time, I guess I've spent my career building, enterprise apps, and enterprise apps tend to live somewhere between 10, 15 years, maybe even 20 years. And UI technologies tend to live maybe 3 to 5 years. Every 3 to 5 years, it seems like we come up with a whole new way of describing UI. And you might say, no, 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 HTML has been around forever, which is true, but Angular hasn't been around forever. React hasn't been around forever. And whatever is going to replace those hasn't been around forever. And it's just a repeating trend over my entire career. I bet you that there's, uh, in terms of modern mainstream UI technologies, nothing has ever lasted longer than maybe 5 or 8 years. Now, I use that qualifier, modern mainstream, because Windows Forms, for a counterexample, Windows Forms has not changed in any meaningful way since 2005. So that's 15 years that if you're a Windows Forms developer, you're like, oh man, I haven't had to learn anything new for 15 years. Woo! And that's pretty awesome, but it's also not what I would think of as a modern mainstream UI, right? Uh, so the point being, I assume when I'm building an enterprise app that at least one or two times, maybe more, I'm going to have to discard the UI and rewrite it from scratch, which should not affect my business logic, right? If my company sells insurance, I have customers, I have an insurance product or multiple products, I have underwriting, I have whatever it is. None of that is affected because we came up with a new way to build a UI. And so this is why it's so important that no business logic go into the UI. And frankly, this is why the web is so horrible. And because it forces you to do the wrong thing, right? I build my business logic in C#, runs on the server, but I want to give my user a good experience. So I have to rewrite and duplicate at least part of my business logic in JavaScript. And This is also part of why I get so excited about WebAssembly, because WebAssembly lets me run .NET in the browser. And so I don't have to duplicate my code or rewrite it. I can write it and maintain it one time. Now, if we look at the bottom part of this diagram, it's the same story, basically, right? I've got my data. It's probably in SQL Server or Cosmos DB or MongoDB or, wherever. It's somewhere. And then I have some data access technology that I'm using to access the database or the data store. And there too, especially, well, I was going to say especially in the .NET world, but this is true in the Java world also. Every few years, somebody comes up with a new shiny way to talk to relational databases. And if you look back at the Microsoft world, we had ADO and ADO.NET and RDO and DAO, and then ODBC, and then the .NET. You get into .NET. We had Link to SQL and Entity Frameworks 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and now Entity Framework Core versions 1 and 2 or 3, and none of these tend to be backward compatible. So on one hand, you can say that writing data access layers is like job security, because every couple 3 years you get to rewrite your code to do exactly what it did before, but using a shiny new technology. And that's kind of depressing, isn't it? Again, the point being that your business logic and your data access technology should not be coupled together in any way. And I know that people have done this. Data sets were a popular one where people would build all sorts of complicated ways to merge business logic into data sets, or bind them to data set events. And people have figured out ways to merge entity framework entity objects with business logic. But again, the problem is that at 2-3 years later down the road, you're like, Microsoft doesn't do data sets anymore. Darn it. I'll rewrite, to use Entity Framework 2. And now, if you had done that, Entity Framework, core is not really compatible with Entity Framework 2. And so you're stuck rewriting it again. My point is that on this slide, the green box is the thing that's going to last forever. And technically, so is the database, right? Those are the two things that probably don't change very fast. Everything else, the interface logic, and the data access, are pretty much subject to change. So over time, I kind of stumbled into this. I wrote some books about this topic back in the 90s, and my software example, which was had the really acronym sexy name of CSLA. Back in the 90s, it should have had an X. Really, it should have been, that would have made it really good, like ActiveX, right? But I didn't. The thing is that a lot of people took the sample code out of the book, and they're like, hey, this is a nice framework. And they started using it, which is awesome. But it wasn't until really the .NET timeframe that I formally thought of it in my mind as being a framework per se, and tried, started maintaining it that way. And but the point is that I'm going to use CSLA because it's got a rules engine, and it's got some design patterns and some coding conventions that help you keep all of your business logic in the green box, and help you avoid leaking that logic into your data access or your interface layers. And so I'm just going to run through just a couple slides because I want to set some, ground, uh, you know, base level, I guess, understanding about what CSLA is. It's an open source framework. You can go to CSLAnet.com. It's in GitHub. In fact, it's look right there in GitHub. It's very exciting. Very active. It's been being maintained actively for one way or another, depending on how you count it, like 23 or more years at this point. And there's, I think, 80 or more people that have contributed over time, and it's nice. And if you're interested in being involved in it, we always are thrilled to have contributors. Because it's been around for so long, it's used or has been used in all sorts of different industries and big companies and little companies, and it's exciting. What's really fun though is because it sits on top of .NET, ultimately this rules engine that CSLA provides can run anywhere .NET runs. So it goes all the way back in time to Windows Forms, but then all the way forward in time to today when it can run on WebAssembly in a browser on an Android or Chromebook device. It can run on Mac OS, Linux clients, everywhere because .NET has wonderfully enough runs everywhere now too. So it's pretty cool. Like I said, CSLA has been around for a long time, and I've enjoyed maintaining and working in the open source world. And I'll pause here and say, because people occasionally are like, "Man, why are you like? Why have you done this? Why do you contribute to open source?" Early in my career, I got my start by using a lot of what at the time was called freeware and shareware. Really, my career, I've got enough gray, I guess, that I predate what we think of today as open source. Um, but it used to be called freeware, used to be called shareware. And, um, in my first couple jobs, I was able to do amazing things that my customers basically, the users of my software, like, wow, how did you solve that problem? And I'm like, well, I really worked hard, and and of course the real answer is that I found some pre-existing software that had been written by somebody that they donated to the world, and I was able to use that to make wonderful things happen. And so, in a sense, CSLA is a way of paying that forward, and saying, "Hey, I built my career on free software to a large degree, and so hopefully, and I'm confident other people have been able to do the same." So that's awesome. The primary features of CSLA, yeah, I'm not going to go through this whole slide. The biggest thing is the business rules and the way that they're encapsulated. But coupled with that, because this whole thing runs inside of the .NET environment, the data binding support turns out to be very important because Windows Forms, WPF, UWP, Xamarin, Blazor, everything, even server web stuff like ASP.NET, MVC, and Razor pages have forms of data binding. And so what CSLA does is mitigates. So when I write an object, that a business domain object that encapsulates all of my business logic, all of those properties become bindable. And what's interesting and kind of sad is that the rules of data binding have changed. Um, Microsoft, way back in the early days, 2002, I guess, with Windows Forms, defined a bunch of things around data binding. And then when WPF came out, they changed the way that they thought about those exact same interfaces and events. And and so if you wrote your code to work with Windows Forms, um, it would technically work with WPF, but would be very inefficient. And so CSLA, for example, mitigates that and does the efficient thing in a WPF environment and the less efficient but necessary thing in Windows Forms, and yet different things in Blazor or in ASP.NET MVC. So it understands the differences between the different data binding models that Microsoft has implemented over time. And again, in my mind, that's because that green box, which is the business logic, ought to just keep working. Your code ought to keep working, even when Microsoft comes up with yet another way of talking to databases or yet another way of creating a UI and thinking about data binding. So It turns out that a lot of my career, at least the part that dealt with Windows, my career started on green screen terminals, but the part that gets fun largely has centered around using smart client devices, and be that Windows PCs or phones, tablets, Macs, whatever it is, where you've actually got an interesting and capable device that the user is interacting with. And in order to give the user the best possible experience, the more of your interface logic, and even some of, or maybe all of your business logic can run on that client device to give the user immediacy, right? There's a reason that we all uh, essentially abandoned the green screen to go to Windows, and then the web came along and was basically green screen terminals except with color. Uh, but then we abandoned that and went to Angular and React and JavaScript, because the user experience on a terminal or in the kind of classic browser, server side web development, is a horrible user experience. And users, including you and me, really like having a better experience. So again, the more code we can run on the client device, the better the experience tends to be. At the same time, when you're writing, especially business enterprise apps, some logic has to run on a server. It needs access to tables with millions of rows of data, or whatever. Some of the logic might be sensitive in that you don't want it to run on a client device, either for security reasons or um, because you just don't want certain data to be out there on the client, or there's a variety of reasons. Maybe you don't trust the client device, right? Um, if you're writing something that's going to run on the internet where you have unknown users and uncontrolled devices, obviously you need your business logic to run somewhere that you know it will run, and that's your server. And for over 20 years now, pretty much all of us have stored our database or our data in some sort of a database server. And I say it that way because um, I used to write a lot of software that used Access databases or FoxPro databases, or things like that, where there was no server for the data. But pretty much I think everybody tends to use SQL Server, Postgres, SQL, MongoDB, something, right? So this is a typical deployment for a 3-year n-tier application. It's also, though, not uncommon, especially if you're writing applications that are running on a phone or a tablet, to have the whole darn app run on the client device, and then maybe call services that are hosted, like RESTful services that are hosted somewhere. And so this is not at all uncommon. If you have this architecture, you almost certainly have implementations of the services themselves. And notice what's happening here is that stack of interface business logic data is in every one of these slides, right? If I'm writing the client app, it's a full app. It has its own business logic. If I'm writing a service like a microservice, it also has business logic, and it has an interface. It's just, in this case, because I'm writing a service, the interface is probably JSON or some Bison, something like that. This is basically the architecture of something like Outlook, where the entire app runs offline with its own database. And then when you're online, it synchronizes with a remote database or a set of services. And, if you, uh, like I live in Minnesota and often go into northern Minnesota, and there are parts of northern Minnesota where there's no cell signal of any sort. And so, if you're, for example, writing an application for insurance adjusters that have to go out and evaluate damage to people's fields or cars or houses, then this would be the architecture for an app like that, because the app has to run completely offline. And then as soon as they drive back into a civilized area that has cell signal, it'll go online and synchronize with the master database. So any questions at this point before I'm about to start talking about WebAssembly and so forth, but
Yeah,
any,
I got a couple questions that I've collected from chat. So the first one is from BQHR. How would you compare CLSA to DDD? That's a lot of letters there.
a lot of
Maybe
letters.
we should start with the other question, which was what does CSLA stand for?
Well, CSLA these days is an unpronounceable word. It doesn't stand for anything. Back in the 90s, it was an acronym for Component-Based Scalable Logical Architecture, because acronyms were cool. And we were all doing component-based programming and blah, blah, blah. And kind of like SOAP. SOAP started out being Simple Object Access Protocol, all the way up until the web services standards made it so that SOAP was absolutely not simple. And so the people that had created SOAP said, no, 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 SOAP is now a word, not an acronym, because if it was still an acronym, everybody would laugh. So CSLA is the same thing. It's
Okay.
just an unpronounceable word.
All right.
Uh,
And how would you compare it to DDD, which I assume is domain driven design?
yeah,
Yep.
domain-driven design. So, and for those that are not familiar, Eric Evans' domain-driven design book, quintessential. Uh, especially in terms of, and so Eric and I disagree probably on some of the specifics of how you might implement things. He really likes the repository pattern, which is not a bad thing, but it still doesn't really tell you where to put the business logic. And CSLA, conversely, is all about the business logic, but doesn't focus much on things like how to talk to the database, which is where repository patterns fit. However, what Eric did if you kind of don't pay so much attention to the coding details and instead pay attention to the bigger picture concepts of how to take a complex business problem and break it apart and examine the domain, analyze it, and then come up with components or objects or whatever you want to use as a term to do, design of your software. It's phenomenal. I absolutely love it. And what's interesting is that Eric's book and my original books kind of came out all at the same time, and we didn't know each other. We still don't really. Not like we're friends, but um, they're synergistic, right? I think his career experience up to that point and my career experience up to that point had apparently been very, very similar, and we ended up coming up with a lot of the same big picture ideas about how you take problems, break them apart into domain areas, and then try and address those. And so that's a really long-winded way of saying that I think they're extremely synergistic. It's just two different implementation approaches on how you might do domain-driven design.
Thank you. That's all the questions so far.
All right, awesome. So I mentioned WebAssembly earlier, and so I want to revisit that, specifically talking about really what is this, because not everybody knows, and it's relatively new. It's only been around for, I want to say, 3 or 4 years, and it's only been in all the browsers, all evergreen browsers, for just a year and a half maybe. And basically, the world that we've lived in since 1990, I want to say 7, when Microsoft introduced Ajax into Internet Explorer, so that it was possible to write code in the browser that could call uh, back to a server, and then Chrome and Firefox, everybody adopted that protocol and gave us what we think of as the modern web. So the browser has HTML, CSS, exposes a document object model, and then you write JavaScript or something that transpiles into JavaScript as your code that runs in the browser. And all of that loads from some server somewhere, right? That's the world that we have been living in for a long time. And the drawback with this is that it's a monoculture. The only programming language that you can use in the browser is JavaScript. And you might say, no, 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 I use TypeScript, or I use Dart, or I use this or that. But again, all of those things transpile. They don't compile, they transpile into JavaScript. So at the end of the day, the only thing you've got is JavaScript. And which is maybe not bad, but it definitely stifles a lot of innovation, and also prevents the use of massive amounts of pre-existing code written in C, C++, C Sharp, Go, Rust, Ruby, etc. So the Mozilla Foundation some years ago started working on this idea that, hey, suppose that in the browser, you could have an assembly language engine that understands how to take assembly language code, compile it native on the device where the browser is running, and then run that assembly language code in the same sandbox. I mean, it sits in the same spot in the architecture as JavaScript, has all the same characteristics in terms of safety, security, and whatever else as JavaScript, except that it's running assembly language. And because it's running assembly language, that means that you can compile, or you can take like a C compiler that would have emitted, actually it's probably the linker to be fair, but would have emitted um, uh, x86 assembly, or ARM assembly, whatever it is, right? Different assembly languages depending on the compilation target. All you've got to do is add a new compilation target to your C compiler process and say, hey, I want to compile with the output being WebAssembly instead of x86 assembly. And so that's exactly what has happened here. So today, right now, all browsers, all evergreen browsers, I should say, so Edge and Chrome, Chromium, all the Chromium-based stuff, Opera, plus Safari, and they were the laggards, right? Apple, Apple probably, I'm sure, put a lot of thought into whether they wanted to do this or not, because this allows us to write real smart client apps using all sorts of different languages and tools that don't need to be deployed through a store, right? So that had to make Apple give some pause, but they did eventually, even on the iPad and iPhone now, they support WebAssembly. Now, if you look at this diagram, though, there's one kind of quirk, and that is that, so now you can still get HTML, CSS, and JavaScript and images that download from the server, and you can get WebAssembly code. So it downloads the assembly language code in a binary, right? It's a binary format, but it's assembly language. And then once it's in the browser compiles it, or the WebAssembly engine in the browser compiles that so that it's native ARM or native x86 or whatever your processor is. And then your code is running in a compiled form on the device, right? Which is pretty awesome, and can, in some cases, give radically better performance than JavaScript, which is largely interpreted with partial compilation, right? The kicker here, though, is that notice that the little blue arrow that connects the document model, the HTML, CSS part, with your code is only on the JavaScript side. And that's on purpose. And that's because today, WebAssembly does not yet have direct access to interact with the DOM. And so all of the UI frameworks that exist, like in C Sharp, there's a couple of them, and there's a Go framework and a Rust framework. Um, all of them use usually a fairly thin layer of JavaScript that they funnel all DOM manipulation through a little JavaScript shim to update the UI and get any UI events back into the program. In the long run, um, what the roadmap for WebAssembly is that WebAssembly will in fact have direct access to the DOM. and you'll be able to just write your entire code in Rust or Go or C Sharp, and never have to write any JavaScript at all or deploy any JavaScript necessarily. Um, which is not to say that you don't, you know, you might not want to keep doing so. Um, it's interesting because the JavaScript world has been the only place that the only way to build web components for many, many, many years. And so there's some really sophisticated and robust charting and graphic libraries, all sorts of cool stuff that exist for JavaScript. And you can use those from your WebAssembly code. And I suspect that will continue for a very, very long time. I think ultimately this picture, some code is going to get written in JavaScript and some is going to get written in Rust, and we're all going to be happy. Like, that's kind of the point. In my mind, this is though why WebAssembly is so compelling, is because now I can write um, an app, a client-side app, a smart client app that has, maybe I write it in Angular, but it needs to do some really heavy math lifting. And so I write the algorithm to do the heavy math in C++, and the JavaScript just calls the C++. Or maybe I'm not a JavaScript expert, which I'm not in real life. And so I tend to think, boy, if I can write my app primarily in C Sharp, where I'm really good, but occasionally call some JavaScript because somebody wrote a really great JavaScript widget that does something really neat in the browser, then that's a win for me, right? So any questions on the whole WebAssembly thing?
One question did come in. It was from Liberty for All. How easy is it to write tests against CSLA compliant code?
Modern CSLA has uh, quite a bit of support for unit testing and dependency injection. Uh, Everything is interface based, so you can in fact do mocking. I mean, it's built to create or to enable you to create enterprise level systems, which are not necessarily easy to test to start with. But uh, so and I'll show you some of the code here in just a few minutes. But it's if you approach the testing from the perspective of what CSLA offers, it's really quite compelling, I think.
Thank you. That's the only question for now.
Okay, got it. So let's see. I think I already talked about that. That's all exciting. So the today I'm going to specifically use a UI framework from Microsoft called Blazor. It's an open source component that's part of ASP.NET Core, and it uses the Razor syntax that most web server developers are used to, but it actually runs your code either on the server or in the browser. And what I'm going to show is running it in the browser itself. So, um, but it's not the only UI framework. There's also the Uno platform, which is a XAML-based framework that runs in the browser. And those are the two primary options for .NET. But then, like I said, if you like Go programming, for example, there's a web UI framework for that world as well. Last bit of slides. I'm almost done with the slides. Uh, the other thing that I'm going to talk about and demonstrate here is running server-side code on Linux, but in particular, running it inside of containers. And the way containers work as a general rule, and Docker is the, was at least what everybody's like, containers and Docker are synonymous. And that was true up until Docker went bankrupt a few months ago and split into two. And everybody's like, wow, that's probably, we maybe shouldn't hinge our entire industry on this one company. And so nowadays there's the Open Container Initiative that defines, and it's based off Docker containers, but it's actually an open standard for container, the way you can think about and describe containers. And so nowadays There's Docker, but there's also something called Containerd that is a container daemon that is becoming rapidly more popular, especially in enterprise settings. And so it's kind of cool, I think. What I'm doing here on my machine is I've got my physical computer and I'm using a hypervisor, in my case, Hyper-V, which gives me a virtual machine. And in that virtual machine, I'm running a service, in a website, actually, ASP.NET service endpoint. Um, but really what I'm doing is that in my virtual machine, I've loaded the container runtime. So, and I am running Docker. So it's running the Docker runtime. And then I can use Docker to load up a container, and my code goes, instead of the code running just in a virtual machine, my code is running in this container. And then I can say, no, I actually want 3 instances of that container, and it'll just give me 3 of them. This is super high level stuff, right? Now, it turns out that the container world started in Linux, and so the Linux container infrastructure is quite robust and mature. And Microsoft a few years ago said, "Oh man, we should make Windows run in containers too." And so there are Windows containers. In my experience with all of Magenics customers and all the things I've done, the only time that we use Windows containers is when you're taking like a .NET framework app or an old Java app that was built for Windows or something, basically a legacy app that runs on Windows, and you can't afford to upgrade it to a modern like .NET Core so that it could run in Linux. And so you're stuck running in Windows, but for some reason you really want it to run in containers, then you use Windows containers. But for all like new software development or migrating, like modernizing old legacy systems, converting everything into .NET Core and then targeting Linux is the better way to go, because the Linux containers are lighter weight, they're more mature, and generally, especially in public clouds, they're cheaper to run. So what that really means in my mind is that the future of server development for .NET is essentially targeting Linux in pretty much every case. Don't tell the Windows people I said that. This is just a bit of curiosity. Sitting behind me on a table, this is my personal Kubernetes cluster. And I'm not actually going to use it in my demo in the interest of time, but Kubernetes is an orchestrator for containers. And so this is a 4-node computer, 4 different computers, right? Every one of them is a Raspberry Pi. One of them is the control node, and the other 3 are worker nodes. And this whole thing costed maybe $400 to put together. And there are recipes for this on the web, how to build a Raspberry Pi Kubernetes cluster. And you can just order these parts from Amazon or buy them at a Micro Center or Fry's or something. But it's really fun to play with. I gotta say, if you want to really learn and understand how Kubernetes works, it's super fun. So blah blah. Oh, I didn't want to quite skip there. So this is what I'm going to demo, and that is a .NET app that has an app server that's running my data access code and so forth, and it's going to run in a container, Linux, running in Docker. And then I'm going to have a Blazor client app that is running in the browser. So the browser is going to be the smart client, and it's going to run the interface logic, and some of my business logic is all going to run in the browser on the client device. It'll talk over the network to the app server that's running in a Docker container. And because it's in a container, one of the cool things about containers is that once I have my code in a container, I can run that container in AWS, I can run it in Azure, I can run it in any Kubernetes location, I can run it in Docker. it's just this deployable unit that I can run almost anywhere. Just really flexible, really compelling. So with that, let's switch screens here. And so I'll run this to start with. And notice if we look at Visual Studio, that I'm going to run my server in Docker, and but it's actually going to visually show up as a browser. So I'll say run it, and now if you look in the build window, this is going to happen fairly quickly, but it's too fast. There we go. You can see that in fact it was kind of an odd. Oh, now I don't know what happened. Look at that. I must have hit a key. Okay, now where'd my browser go? There it is. Now, before I run the app itself, I want to show you some things that Visual Studio 2019 is now doing. Because I'm running in a container-based world, Visual Studio now has a container window that says, hey, look, you're running in a container. Your container has the following environment variables. And if you get into cloud-based, cloud native development, you really should go to 12factor.net. So that's 12factor.net. And it's a set of 12 design patterns that if you follow them will make your life almost infinitely better for building cloud-based apps, which pretty much if you're running in containers, that's what you're doing, right? One of the design patterns is that all of your configuration for your app should come from the environment, not from things like a web config file. Basically, stop using config files. That's the short version of that, and instead put all of your things in environment variables. And so, look, here they are. Yay! I can look and say my container is exposing port 80 locally, but on my computer, it's actually showing up as 32770. So this is my local host port. Here's the logs that, and so that's another one of the design patterns is that when you are writing container-based software, you should just stream your logs out to standard out and standard error, which are Linux terms generally, but all those fancy logging frameworks that we've been using forever, really in a container-based world, I'm not saying they're useless, but your primary output for your logs should be standard out. So basically console.writeline. So that's interesting. And then here in my container, here are all of the files. So a container is kind of like a virtual machine. It's actually a Linux instance. And so you can see if you're used to Linux, here's my bin, and here's my etc. and my boot and dev, and all of my file system for Linux is here. And and then my app is actually in the app folder. So this is my .NET Core app. And look, you can see my source code is in here. And because I ran this in debug mode, we can see that all of my DLLs and resources are here. This is, again, the way containers work is that when I build my server-side app in Visual Studio, it actually builds it on Linux, and the output, the result of my build process is a container image, which is a file that can be deployed into any location that can run containers. So again, basically I can take this file and give it to Azure or AWS or whatever, and it knows how to run it. So I think that's pretty cool. It's also the case that because I'm in Visual Studio, I've got the full debugging experience. So even though my code is currently running on Linux in a virtual machine in a container, Microsoft still connected the debugger to it. So I've got my normal debugging experience, just like I would if I had been running it in IIS Express. So where'd my browser go? That's not my browser. Uh-oh. There it is. So here's my browser. It launched. Notice that I'm running in localhost 32.770, which was the port that's exposed from that container. So I'm talking to a Linux endpoint here. And what's running in my browser right now is, in fact, if I go look here and redo a refresh, we can see that what's running here is that I'm running Blazor WebAssembly. You know, it downloaded my actual code, my compiled code, and a little JavaScript shim to talk to the browser's DOM. But what's actually running here is running on the client side. So it's a smart client app. You can think of it as like Windows Forms or WPF or Angular or React. They're all kind of the same, right? In that I'm running my code on the client device, and that's true whether it's a Windows PC or a Chromebook or an iPhone. Um, this would work in all those cases. Now, if I click the list people, it's going to go out and get a list of people. That's exciting. And what happened here is that it actually called my web server, right? An endpoint that's running in that Docker container. And so uh, I think this is kind of fun in that essentially this is running in Chrome, right? So I'm using a Google browser running in a Mozilla built framework, which, WebAssembly comes from Mozilla. I am running .NET Core or Blazor, right? But that's open source, and so that's from Microsoft. It's making a call across the network using standard HTTP, and then it's talking to a Linux server running in Docker. Basically, what I'm getting at is that we're in this interesting and I think really fun new world where, yes, I'm a Microsoft developer using .NET, but I'm running on platforms that are not Microsoft platforms. My server is not Microsoft, and my client is not Microsoft. Um, it's for somebody like me that's been in the Microsoft world for long enough. Brain kind of hurts your brain a little bit. That's what I'm saying. All right, so if I click, I'd say, oh, I'd like to edit this, and it says, no, not authorized. And this is actually a feature, kind of a combination feature of Blazor and of CSLA, because it's a business rule that says that you have to be logged in first. I've got a fake login here, so I'll click login, and it just creates for me a claims identity, standard .NET concept here. And says, puts me in an admin role. And so now if I go back and I would like to edit a person, now I get to edit that person. And here's where we really start to see kind of a combination of where Blazor and CSLA really work well together. So this is a data, object out of a database that has a ID of 1 and a value of Andy. But my domain object that I'm dealing, somebody had asked about domain-driven design, right? So what's behind this page is a domain object. That domain object has all of the rules around editing person information. And so one of the rules is that we should show the user some tooltip that says this is a required field, right? One of the rules constantly is calculating the length of the value. So you can see that as this is just a business rule. And somebody had asked about unit testing. And so this is a rule that is a standalone thing that can be tested. I'll show you that in a sec. We know that this is not a new object. This domain object was loaded from existing data in the database. And currently it's savable because it doesn't have any broken rules. But for some reason, and I don't know why, my users told me that no name should have a Z in it. Honestly, it's because it makes for a good demo. So if I put a Z, a couple kind of key things happen. First off, this is the output from a business rule. that says that no Z's are allowed. Again, that's a testable rule that's just attached to this property. But now savable turned false because there's this broken rule, and also the save person button disabled. This is a use of data binding. Anybody who's done XAML is like, oh yeah, I understand how that works. And Blazor supports very similar concepts. So because the domain object is not valid, it doesn't want it, it doesn't, won't allow itself to be saved. And then the UI just reflects that. If I get rid of that Z, that's all good. There's another rule in here that says that if the first letter of my name, if I type Rocky or whatever else I might type, we think the first letter of all names probably should be capitalized. And so this is a warning severity. So there are 3 levels, right? Error, warning, and info. And so I can show all 3 at once, right? Warning, error, warning, and info rules. But notice that just because I've got a warning, I can still save. It's still a savable object. It's just we're telling the user we think the first letter probably should be capitalized. But we don't want to make that a rule because this maybe we're typing names in from a country or nationality where the first name or the first letter is not capitalized by convention like it is in the US or Europe. So I can say save, yay, now it's saved. So let's look at how this actually works inside under the covers. So we'll stop this and go have a look at my code or at my solution. Let me collapse this a little bit. So this is a demo solution, right? So it shows maybe more than it needs to, but it's got the Blazor example server. So that's the app server. It's got Blazor example client. So this is the client app that's actually deployed and running in the browser. It's got some shared code that runs on both the client and the server. And because I'm being kind of proper with this, I've got a formal data access layer and then 2 concrete implementations, one for as a mock database and one using Entity Framework. And so those are pluggable. So if we look, for example, at the server, it's just ASP.NET Core. And in the startup code here, whoa, that's pretty tiny. Let's make that bigger. In the startup code, when we're initializing everything and setting it all up, somewhere lurking in here, we've got a line that says, hey, when we want to use the data access layer, we should be using that mock data access layer. Or we can switch and say, no, we'd actually like to use the Entity Framework data access layer. And so you get to kind of pick, but that's using dependent standard, ASP, or really, I shouldn't say ASP, standard .NET Core dependency injection. So that's, I think, useful all by itself. But I don't want to focus so much on the data access layer. I really want to focus more on this person edit class, which is the domain object that was sitting behind that UI. And so this particular class has an ID property that we saw, and it also has a name property. Notice that the name property is required, which I guess I didn't show that. I didn't blank it, but it is in fact a required property. But then it also, the name property, has a couple other rules attached. In addition to being required, we have an information text rule that says that the UI can, if it wants to, and should probably, be displaying this informational text. We've got that warning level rule that checks the case of the first letter to make sure it's uppercase. We've got the no Z allowed rule that gives an error if there's a Z in the name. And we've also got a rule that calculates the number of letters in the field. And so let's look at this. This is maybe the simplest of the bunch to start with. So the way the CSLA rules engine works is that every rule is a class. And the intent here, this is out of a book from David West called Object Thinking, another book that I highly recommend, fantastic book. And one of the things that he talks about in that book at some length is the idea of rules as being, as a standalone concept. So a rule being a class. And it's an idea that really works well for, in particular, being testable, because you can write unit tests for this rule, and then the rule can be attached to properties where you need to, but you have high confidence that the rule itself works. You see what I'm saying? And you don't have to test every property that it's attached to necessarily. So the way this rule works is when the rule is executed by the rules engine, it goes out and gets the value of the property that it's attached to, finds the length of that property, and then sets the output value to that length. And so the rule itself requires a primary property, that's the like the string that it's attached to, and then it also requires an output property that it's going to alter in order to put in the length of the count. Then let's look at one more. We'll look at the no z allowed silly rule. Um, this gets attached to a property, and so then again we grab the property value and see if it contains a z, and if it contains a z, then we just add an error result with the text. And of course, this super simple. I'm just hard coding this value, but in real life, if you wanted, for example, to be globalized, this text would be coming out of a resource file, so that it can be done in Spanish and French and English and so forth. Hopefully, this makes some pretty good sense. So these rules are individually testable, and then they get attached to properties. And the great thing is, because they could be attached if we say, well, we want to check the case, the first letter of lots of strings, right? We could do that in many different properties on many different domain objects with high confidence that this rule does what we think it does. So the kind of the point here is that rules can go anywhere from a simple rule that shows some informational text to a complicated complicated, but a validation rule um, to something that actually calculates a value. And so these are simple rules for a demo, but you can imagine having a rule that calculates your insurance rate um, based on inside of a domain object that represents an insurance policy or an insurance quote, or a tax calculation. So you might have a tax calculation rule that implements all the different ways that you can calculate taxes in the U.S. or like. Well, I don't want to get too sidetracked. I did some work once living in Alabama many years ago, and compared to Minnesota, their tax system is a lot more complex because they have city taxes and county taxes and state taxes, right? And so taxes are not, or value added tax if you're in Europe. It's pretty fun in a weird way. All right. So now let's look at the Blazor part, because all of this code is running on the client side and on the server side. This domain object, if I kind of zoom in here, my person edit object that is the domain object and my rules that we were talking about, they're all in this Blazor example.shared. So this project compiles to a .NET standard DLL and deploys to the server, and it deploys to the client. So both sides have full access to the business logic, which is kind of important because we want the logic to run on the client to give the user a great immediate experience, but we might not trust the client. So we also want the logic to run on the server to revalidate all the same stuff, but we don't want to maintain the logic twice. So we write the logic once and then run it in two different places. To me, this is something I've been talking about and doing for over 20 years. But we took a detour with the JavaScript web where you really can't do that unless you write all your server code also in JavaScript, right? So which people do. That's what Node is all about, or Dino. All right, so the client, this is the actual app that's running in the browser. So this project is um, a Blazor client, and this is something that's part of Visual Studio now, .NET Core 3.1. And in here, if I look at the project, I've got a www root, which basically is where I get to put all of my CSS, because this is ultimately an HTML-based solution. And by default, Microsoft is using Open Ionic and Bootstrap, but you don't have to. You can replace all the CSS that's in here with your own. We've got pages, and now these are the Razor pages that are actually displayed to the user. And so one of them, for example, is edit person. This is the one that we were focusing on. Now, if you're familiar with Razor syntax, this will look familiar. It's a little different because Blazor is able to do some things because it's running on the client that traditional server-side Razor can't do. But you say, hey, here's my routing. So this page can be accessed directly, or it can be accessed by passing in a parameter. And we've got, we want to use a namespace, and then we're doing dependency injection. So we want to inject my view model, which gives me access to my domain object. And also, because we're going to do some navigation, we want to inject the Blazor navigation manager so we can write code that will navigate. And we want to make sure that only admin level users have access to this page. And so we're saying that if you're not in the admin role, then Blazor won't let you in. Then we got some pretty standard HTML, right? Now here we start to get to where CSLA is helpful because we've injected that view model that gives me access to my domain object. The view model itself tracks what's going on in terms of any exceptions that might happen during the lifetime of the domain object. And so at the top here, I've just got some text that displays if, in fact, there's an exception that occurs. Now, the way Blazor works is that when the page first loads, the view model may or may not have been loaded. And so it's pretty much every Blazor page you ever see will start out by saying, hey, if the thing I'm going to bind to is null, then display some loading text or an animation or whatever. Otherwise, I'm going to, in fact, give you the edit screen that you're, or the display screen. So my list of people link that lets me go back to the list of people. I probably should do this with divs, but I'm lazy, so I'm using table. I apologize to all the web purists in the world. But here we start seeing data binding the way Blazor does it. So this is binding to my view model dot model, which has an ID property, right? That's the type of model is person edit. And so I've got my ID property. And then here we start again tapping into some of what CSLA does. So we can say, hey, does the current user have the authorization to read the name property? And this is a business rule that I could put into my domain object saying only certain people or people in certain roles or with certain claims are allowed to read this value. So if the current user is not allowed to read this value, nothing displays. But if they are, then we're going to add this row into the table. And in this row, we generate the friendly name. And again, this is a kind of a rule thing. So if we go back here, for example, I can say that I would like a display name. What is it? Name equals some property. And that would change the UI. So instead of having the word name on there, it would actually display some property. And this is important because this allows for localization, globalization type stuff. Then we allow the user to edit the name property. And I'll come back to that in a bit. I don't want to, I've been going over an hour now. So, but let's just keep going down. So here I'm binding to the name length property. I'm binding to the is new property and the is savable property. These two are standard. These are like provided by CSLA. There's a whole set of meta state properties that you can use to interrogate your domain object to find out whether it's valid or invalid, and whether it's been edited, changed or not, all sorts of things. And then the button that the user can click to save the update here, update the changes. Notice that first of all, its on-click event uses a type of binding that's binding to a method that saves the domain object. Actually, it asks the view model to do the saving, right? But this is kind of cool because you can use event binding. So any event in your UI can bind to a method in your view model or your code behind, whatever you choose, to take an action. So it gives a nice layer of indirection. Also, the disabled property of this button is being bound to whether the object is currently savable. And so again, because CSLA is monitoring to understand at all times whether the domain object has any broken rules, then the button automatically turns on or off without me having to write code to do that. I just bind it. As the page loads, there's some page events that fire off here. So when the page is first initialized, I set up a couple event handlers. And when the parameters are set, so remember that my page can be navigated directly or it can be navigated to by passing in an ID. So I look to say, hey, did I get an ID? And if I did not get an ID, then I'm going to create a new person. And if I did get an ID, then I'm going to go retrieve an existing person based on that ID value. But that's all the code that I need. All of the rest of the code is completely encapsulated either through data binding or the rules that are in that domain object. So I'll pause at this point. Any questions?
Yes, a couple of questions have come in. And another one just came in. So I want to start with a question from Lambert Pix first. I can't read the font very well. Running rules against multiple properties or objects are always fun. Any examples of that? I think he's using fun ironically there.
Yeah, I would agree. So yeah, this letter count is in fact an example of that, where it's binding to a text property to get the value to count, and then it's also binding to an output property that it's going to update. And so I go get the text property, generate the count, the text.length, and then update that output. But there's nothing stopping you from saying, CSLA, core.i property, info, we'll call it secondary property because I'm feeling original. I can put a secondary property here. I can say input properties.add my secondary property. And now what I'll be able to do is, go out and get, text2 off from my context input properties. I'm doing this the hard way, but I can actually just grab it this way. But yes, this is all supported. Input property values and number 2 or something. There's better ways to write this, but hopefully you get the idea that this allows me to create rules that run against multiple properties, maybe pull in multiple property values, and potentially output multiple property values. And that's all within the context of one domain object. But in a lot of cases, your domain object graph is more complex. And so you think about something like a sales order. That would be a domain object, but then it might have a collection of line items. So um, you might have a rule in the sales order that is triggered when a line item changes, and the rule in the sales order recalculates the total discount, price, tax, and so forth for the whole sales order. And so it's totally realistic, more complex, obviously, to have a rule here that is, in fact, walking through an entire object graph, collecting data from different objects in the graph in order to execute the rule.
Great. I got some feedback on that saying excellent. I have some questions from Ganesh. This is someone who seems very eager to start getting into it. First question: are there any resources to get started with CSLA from, say, like .NET New, Blazor, Wasm? Do you have any templates like that? And barring that, do you have any? Do you have this code? Is it going to be featured on GitHub somewhere? I think we're seeing the answer to that is yes.
The answer is yes. So to kind of both, if we go to first off, go to CSLANet.com. This is the landing page. There's a whole bunch of information links here. Getting started with CSLA. There's a bunch of book and video material that's available, plus some wikis that are online, and a quite quite active discussion forum. There's also in the main repository a samples directory, and so there's a whole set of samples here. The biggest sample is Project Tracker. That's the one that I use when I'm writing all of my books, and so that tends to be the most complex of the bunch. But the one that I was just using is this one here called Blazor example. But then there's a whole bunch of other, different UIs and all sorts of things that the rules engine. A gentleman named Johnny Beckham from Norway uh, did a lot of work over the years on the rules engine, and he wrote this beautiful tutorial on all the different ways that you can use the rules engine. So, because I only scratched the surface, right? I mean, somebody asked about rules that talk to multiple properties, which is good, right? But then there's also asynchronous rules that run in the background, and just all sorts of cool stuff. So,
Great. That's all the questions I've accumulated so far.
all right. So I'm pretty much done at this point. I guess I think I've talked. Yeah, I probably may have talked enough. What do people think? I can go for a little bit more. I've got one more kind of conceptual area I can talk about, but I also want to be respectful of people's time.
Sure. Go ahead, and if you are interested in seeing more chat, just say so in the chat room there. I personally would love to hear more about the Minnesota tax code.
Ah,
Because in Ohio, I have the same sort of thing: city taxes, county taxes, school taxes, and Alabama. I mean, that's the same way. So,
yep.
but we don't have to talk about tax codes. So far, we've got three people saying yes, give us more. We're sponges.
Okay.
More would be awesome. Can we get an overall high level summary to wrap it all together in a nice bow?
We can do both.
Okay.
So, um, yes, I don't know. I did some error in here, but that's all right. I won't run this code again, maybe. Uh, so the kind of to close the loop on this whole thing, um, so here we are in this edit person page, and the user maybe does some changes, edits some things, and then they do click this button to save. And so what happens then? Or you could say, what is this line doing here when we're going out and retrieving an instance of this domain object based on the ID that got passed in? Either way, we have to call the app server, right? So the client app, because again, this is .NET Core, uses dependency injection for a lot of its configuration. And so as the client app starts up in the browser, we set up a builder, set up a singleton HTTP client object that has a base address of the server it came from. Obviously, you could have passed in the server URL as a environment variable. We add some authorization. This is all Blazor stuff. This too is Blazor stuff, but it's provided by CSLA. So um, because Blazor has this really, I think, nice authentication scheme built into it that's based on ASP.NET. But we're also trying to make it seamlessly work with the CSLA business rules engine. And so CSLA provides some state providers that kind of help tie those together. We also set up the CSLA, what's called a data portal. And the data portal is a concept in CSLA that abstracts the idea of talking to application servers. And so in particular, we say, okay, we're going to use CSLA, we're going to configure the data portal, and we want the data portal to talk to the app server using HTTP. And here's the address of the endpoint. And it's a partial address because, again, HTTP client was configured with the base address already. So this is actually something like, local host, I forget the number now, 32 something, whatever the number, right? That's what it would be if you typed the whole thing. And then we build that. And that means that at this point, the all of these services that were defined are now available for dependency injection, both into Blazor, but also into CSLA. So all of these services become available. And so hopefully, that's kind of cool. And so when the view model is asked to retrieve or save an instance of the domain object, it in turn asks this data portal, hey, would you, and the data portal basically has 5 verbs. It knows how to create, fetch, update, execute, and delete. So it's crude, is instead of CRUD, it's crude because it can execute things. So that relays to something on the server, right? Well, let's see. So API data portal. So let's look at the server project here. We would think then we probably have a controller called data portal. And oh, look, there is in fact a controller called data portal on the server. And this is just a standard REST API endpoint, but it inherits from a CSLA construct called an HTTP portal controller. And really pretty much all this code is just this is just here for fun, kind of a diagnostic. So if you navigate to the URL through a browser, you can see that it's in fact running. And this is because you don't even need this, other than sometimes you might want to put a breakpoint in here just for fun, right? What is interesting though, and this is a Blazor artifact, is that Blazor sits on top of WebAssembly. And right now, WebAssembly, its TCP connectivity only allows text data to flow through, not binary. And so normally, right, what we're sending back and forth here is hopefully compressed binary data, right? Except in the case of Blazor or just WebAssembly in general, right now we can only pass text. And so when this controller starts up, we're saying, hey, I need you to use text serialization. So it takes what would have been binary data and base 64 encodes it so that it can be transferred to and from Blazor, which is sad, and hopefully is a limitation that will go away at some future version of WebAssembly. And this particular thing is a CSLA thing, but the limitation is a Blazor limitation, or a WebAssembly limitation, if that makes sense. So this HTTP portal controller, this is the thing that actually accepts your inbound request to do a create, fetch, update, delete type operation. And the data portal, I don't want to get into the depths of it. There's a lot of stuff on the website and in my books about that. But ultimately what happens is that if we go back to my person edit class and then go down toward the bottom, there's different ways to implement this. But what happens is that if we tell the data portal that we want to create a new instance of this domain object, the data portal will in fact create a new instance of the object, and then it invokes this method so that you can write code to load the object with data. And if you tell it you want to retrieve an existing object, this one's more fun, it'll call the method that you've got decorated with fetch. And so here, this method, so it creates an instance of the object and then calls this method and passes in the ID value. That's the parameter from the UI, right? And then it also injects reference to the data access layer, so that, and again, I talked about that earlier, how on the server we set up the data access layer, this iPersonDal type, so that it's an injectable type. In here, then I call the data access layer and say, hey, go out and, because it's an iPersonDal, right? So I can just say get data based on this ID value. I go into probably should do that. That's better code, right? I go into a using block that turns off the rules engine temporarily. And the reason that we typically do that is because when I'm loading data from the database, it's more efficient to just take the data from the database, load it into my domain object without running rules. And then after the data is loaded, I might choose to run rules to see if the object's any good. Or I might not, right? If you trust all the data in your database, you don't really need to run the rules for an object that you just loaded from the database. And I've worked in both environments, right? I've worked in environments where the databases were kept super clean and didn't ever have bad data. But so often I've worked for organizations where the database is like, yeah, we think most of it's pretty good, but we're not sure. So it's not a bad thing to load the data. Anyway, CSLA's got this thing called data mapper. And that is copying the data from my entity object into my domain object. You might say, Rocky, wait, isn't there this thing called AutoMapper, another open source project? Why aren't you using that? And I love AutoMapper. Got no, the thing is, CSLA predates AutoMapper by, I think, 6 or 7 years. And so I had to write my own. In retrospect, I probably should have written data mapper as its own thing, not part of CSLA, if that makes sense, because then it could have been used as a standalone construct. But there's in fact tons of stuff in CSLA that if I had it to do over again, and this is true for things I wrote 6 months ago, right? You write code and then 6 months later you come back and look at your own code and you're like, what was I thinking? Only now I've got 23 years worth of code that I go back and I'm like, Rocky, you idiot, what were you thinking? So anyway, if you know what AutoMapper is, that's what's going on here. Is it's mapping the entity data into my domain object. When the user clicks save, then some interesting things happen, because remember that my domain object, if I look at this, I can find out, is it a new object? Is it dirty? Has it been changed, basically? Right? There's these metadata properties. And so the data portal on the server looks at the domain object and says, hey, this is a new object, thus it needs to be inserted. Or this is an existing object, thus it needs to be updated. Or this object is marked for deletion, thus it needs to delete itself. And so you ideally then just have to implement for example, an update method and say, hey, if I'm told to update the data, I'm going to need access to the person DAL again. So I'm going to inject that. I'm going to turn off the rules engine temporarily because I don't need rule. I might change the data in this process. And in fact, if we look at insert is maybe better for this, because in the case of insert, I'm going to get a new data entity object. I'm going to copy the name property. I could use data mapper here, I guess. I'm going to copy the uh, name property from my domain object into the data object, right? Then I'm going to insert it, but the result of an insert is that's when I get my primary key value for the ID, because it's created by the database, right? And so that's why I turn off the rules engine while doing like database inserts and updates, is because I might change the data during this process, and I probably don't want my rules to run during this happening. So it primarily is a performance concern. Right, there's no way for me as the author of this little bit of code talking to the data access layer to know what kind of rules might get triggered, right? And maybe it's a complex, expensive rule. Oh, and then you might say, well, wait a minute, Rocky, this is horrible. You've got data access code in your domain class. But I don't, in fact, right? And this is, I think, the really important thing to understand here is that the data access code is here in this data access layer. And I'm calling this data access layer. What I've got in here is my mapping code, because in many, many cases, I have found that database queries, database views, database tables don't match the shape of my domain object, because my domain objects are created based on good object-oriented modeling, domain-driven design, and thus my domain objects tend to look a lot like the UI and not very much at all like the database. And this is an old problem called the data object relational mismatch, or impedance problem. And I've been talking too long. My brain's going fuzzy. But this is a well-known problem, and you might be able to solve it using fancy ORM tools, but I find that more often than not, it's easier to just write just a teeny bit of code like this to do mapping between my entity and my domain types. On top of which is, again, working in complex enterprise scenarios, I might in fact be talking to two different, so I might be talking to, let's do AS400 dot I person DAL, right? I don't actually have this in this code, but I might have to do a DAL update here, and I also might have to do an AS400 dot update of some other data. Right, that's totally plausible, and in fact, in my experience, pretty common, where some of my data is stored in MongoDB and some of it's stored in AS400, or some of it's also stored in a SQL server. And so my data access layer, I actually talk to multiple data sources in order to load or save my domain objects. And so CSLA enables that using a technique like I'm showing you here. So that pretty much sums up all of the coding things I wanted to show. So in terms of kind of wrapping up the whole thing, I think if we go back to this slide, this really highlights what I hope to show you today, and that is that from an architectural perspective, you can use WebAssembly to create code that runs in any browser anywhere. And if you happen to be building your business layer using CSLA, you could also say the same thing about Xamarin, right? You might build it using Xamarin and build mobile apps that run everywhere. If you look forward to .NET, I think Microsoft is now planning this for .NET 6. They've got this project Maui that they talked about not that long ago at Build. And Maui is like the next evolution of both WinUI and Xamarin. So their intent is to have a UI framework that allows you to write a client-side app that targets Windows, Mac, iOS, and Android, and maybe other platforms. So, I mean, this is pretty compelling, I think, right? So if you look at this slide and say, instead of, I could use Blazor, I could use that Uno platform, which also targets WebAssembly. I could use Xamarin, I can use WPF. When it comes out, I can use Maui. All of those are options to create my front end, for the user. I'm going to talk over the network using HTTP or maybe gRPC. So, because I didn't show you that, but CSLA supports gRPC as well, to talk to your app server. Probably as time goes on, more and more you're going to find your app server code, your .NET Core, ASP.NET Core code is going to be running on Linux in a container, maybe in Azure, maybe in a Kubernetes cluster. And so that's all awesome. Basically, my vision and what I push people toward when possible is that your CI/CD DevOps pipeline, its output is a container image, that you just deploy into your test environment, and if it works there, you deploy the same container into production, right? And then underneath here, you talk to one or more databases, maybe SQL Server, Postgres, Mongo, Cosmos, whatever makes you happy. So this is what I've tried to show you today. Hopefully this was fun and interesting. And if there are any questions, I'm willing to wrap them up.
Rocky, thank you very much. We got a couple more questions that have come in. One of these might be a bit much to answer in today's session, but I'll maybe give a short answer. The first one, though, is from Liberty for All. How easy is it to retrofit, let's say, CSLA code into a mature development project? For example, if it's 80% done already, can I just start using CSLA in there?
Yeah, retrofitting can be probably a challenging effort. I think a lot depends on whether. No, it's just going to be tough. Yeah, I was going to try and qualify it, but no, it's going to be hard. Because you almost certainly, if you're 80% done, you've got a bunch of pre-existing business logic. If you're like most folks, the business logic might be half in the UI behind various events, or maybe it's in a view model or in a controller. And so you're going to have to tease that logic out into a set of domain types, and take all of your rules and encapsulate them into rule objects and so forth. So yeah, it's definitely a tall order, I think.
And the other question, again, this is probably more we can answer today, but from Kung Fury Keyboard, isn't Maui just Xamarin repackaged?
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay.
But it'll end up being 2 years worth of evolution of Xamarin, combined with evolution of WinUI. So yes, you're right, but it's like it's 2 major versions of Xamarin away. So they've got some pretty ambitious plans if you look at what they're talking about.
Okay, and if anyone else has any questions, you can go ahead and throw them in the chat there. I do want to say that unfortunately we can't do a round of applause like we normally do for in-person sessions, but a lot of great comments coming in, a lot of really positive feedback about the session. People are really excited about it, so thank you very much. I'll give you a round of applause in proxy for everybody.
Well, thank you very much.
And everyone else can throw your favorite emote in there. I'll even turn on the emote wall if you want to throw some emotes around. Integer Man says clappage is going on. That's an odd way to express
yeah, I'm not
inventing
sure
a new word, but
right.
Let's not think about that too much. All right. So I'm not seeing any more comments or questions coming in, and you have given us more than we asked for, so really appreciate that. I don't want to hold you on the line very much. But the last thing we do want to wrap up is our what is it? The prize drawing, the raffle. So I don't know for sure if we have the JetBrains license available this month. Usually Calvin's the one who sends it over to me. So it might be sitting in our CONDG email box somewhere. I'm not 100% sure. I'm going to proceed as if we do have that, though. Just keep in mind that if you win this, you may not get anything, or it may be a few days before I'm able to get it to you. So that's the first prize, is a JetBrains license. Second place prize, which I will actually show you here, I have in my possession, is this lovely Couchbase branded messenger bag. And I will fill it with some Couchbase goodies, some stickers and pens and stuff like that, and mail that to you, assuming you're in the United States. If you're outside the United States, I'll not be able to do that, so sorry. But this is your last chance to get a message there into the Twitch chat that will automatically enter you into the drawing. And I've got my Couchbase query running over here, so I can start drawing names. So I'll give you a few more minutes. Yeah, it is Schrodinger's license, exactly. I don't see why we wouldn't get one. I think they send it to us automatically, but they did change licensing recently, so who knows? Who knows what's going on? But it's a JetBrains license, and I'll tell you more about that when we get to the first place prize. So does anybody else want to get entered to this raffle? Please throw your messages into the chat. You must be present to win, by the way. And if you are chosen as the winner, you can whisper to me on Twitch, whisper your email address, or you can just email me directly. It's me@mgroves.com. I showed it earlier in the presentation. Just email me your home address, and I will ship this out to you if you're the second place winner. If you're the first place winner, I just need your email address, and I will email you the JetBrains license. All right, are we all set? Going once, going twice. Okay, yes, Kung Fury Keyboard is here. All right, this is for the Couchbase Messenger bag. I'll hit the execute button here. This will pick randomly from someone who has been chatting during the session, and away we go. Drum roll, please. It is BQHR. BQHR, are you here? Are you here, BQHR? Please say something in the chat. Otherwise, we'll have to pick another name. BQHR. We need some music for this, some Jeopardy music or something. It seems like BQHR has bailed. Oh, going once for BQHR, going twice. All right. Okay, going on to next. Rolling again. Here we go. Second place prize goes to lucky number 11. I know lucky number 11 already bailed. He rated from the end of a busy stream, so I'm going to assume lucky number 11's not here. Sorry about that, lucky number 11. Maybe next time. Okay, and rolling again. It is Lambert or Iambert. I'm pretty sure it's Lambert Picks. Lambert Picks, are you still around? I think you just said a little message there in chat, Schrodinger's license, so are you still around? Yes, okay, so make sure to whisper me or email me your address, assuming you're in the United States, and I will get this prize package sent over to you. First place now is JetBrains, so if you're not familiar with JetBrains, go to jetbrains.com. Hopefully you're familiar with them by now. They are the maker of fine products like ReSharper and Writer, but also lots of other cool stuff like IntelliJ and Data Grip and all kinds of great stuff. And we are giving away a license to any one of those products. So that is going to be a digital reward. I'll just email it to you. Yes, Writer is a great tool. Absolutely. Okay, and the winner of JetBrains license is lucky number 11 again. So he really is lucky today. All right, we'll try it again. Lucky number 11 again. This is not going random function. You're not really helping me today. Come on, work with me now. Integer man. The fix is in. The fix is in. He waves. Okay, we're going to the next one. And it's Polarin or Polrin. Polrin, are you around? Polrin. Say hello in the channel there. If you're still around, you're going to win this fabulous JetBrains license. Get emailed to you. Polarin, are you here? Please say something. Will someone please take this prize? Okay, polar in going once, or polar in going twice. All right. Charlotte Toady, looks like you got in just under the wire here as well. I don't have a less than range on this, so you've already been entered into the prize as well. Maybe a loophole we have to figure that. Integer man, okay. Random number generator, not working with me. Liberty for all, liberty for all. Are you still there, Mr. Wallace? Didn't mean to dox you there if I just did accidentally. Sorry. Liberty for all. He's here. Okay. There you go. You win the JetBrains license. And I think I have your email address already. But if not, contact me with your email address and I will get you that prize. Okay. Well, thank you very much, everybody. And thank you again to Rocky, who is, you can't see him. His video is off, but he is still listening.
Yes.
And
Yeah, it was
still
a
listening to
pleasure.
me anyway.
Yep.
Thank you very much. I'm so glad we can make this happen. And our next meeting will be on August 27. So make sure to look at the Conda group on Meetup and Twitter and so on to see where that'll be hosted. It may not be here on my Twitch stream. It may be someone else's Twitch stream or Teams or something. We don't even know. But just keep an eye on that. And thank you everybody for attending. So I'm just going to hang out here for another few minutes if anyone wants to talk about looking for employment or looking to hire. And I'll put on some trivia here in a second. But I want to let you go, Rocky. Thank you very much for the call again. And I'll close Zoom now.
Great. Thank you so much.
Later. Oh, yes. I forgot about O'Calvin's. Yes. If you're interested in O'Calvin's, just let Integer Man know there, and he will open up a Google Meet, no, a Zoom call, something like that, and paste the URL in the chat there. So if you're interested in a little after Hangout Zoom, just say hey in the channel, and Integer Man will set that right up. All right. I have a little bit of water here. A few more minutes. Let people hang out and chat if they want to. If you're looking for work again, if you're hiring or you are looking to get hired, you can email me or you can say something in the chat here. Totally allowed either way. You can't believe how active that repo was on GitHub. Well, I mean, it's been around a long time. Like you said, it predates AutoMapper, which has itself been around a long time. So it probably didn't even start out on GitHub. That's probably how long it's been around. Yeah, right. Not even Git, right? It probably started out on, who knows, CVS maybe, or Subversion or something like that. Or what was it, Teams Foundation Services, whatever it's called, TFS, back in the day. All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody, and we'll see you next time. I'm going to throw some trivia on. You think O'Calvin's is a bust this evening? We did go a little long. So that's okay. No problem. Next time, maybe we'll have Calvin back on. But I'm going to throw trivia on for now, and I will see you all later.